Hey there, and welcome to, your own personalized deep dive.
Hmm.
Today we're going kind of deeper than the headlines to uncover what makes Hezbollah tick.
Right.
Um,
Yeah, they're not just another militant group. I mean, their story has really fascinated analysts for decades now.
yeah, you brought along this Wikipedia article about their military activities, which feels like a good place to start, I guess. Our mission today is to kind of go beyond just slapping a label on them and really dig into what makes this group tick. So we really want you to walk away from this deep dive with a better understanding of their origins, their capabilities, and why they're at the center of so much debate.
Right. Wikipedia article is a really great foundation to build on because it gives us this general overview of all the big facts and controversies that surround Hezbollah.
Okay, perfect. So to really wrap our heads around this group's complexity, I think we need to rewind the clock a bit. The article says that Hezbollah emerged during the chaos of the Lebanese Civil War in '82 with some serious backing from Iran. What was it about that moment in time that allowed them to rise like they did?
Well, Lebanon in the early 80s was a nation really divided. The Civil War created this power vacuum and a real need for security, especially within the Shia community. Iran saw an opportunity to back a Shia proxy, so they provided a ton of support to the newly formed Hezbollah.
And get this, their name literally translates to Party of God. That's pretty powerful branding, especially in a region where religion and politics are so intertwined.
Yeah, no kidding. It says a lot about their ideology.
Hmm.
They blend political activism with religious conviction, and that resonated with a lot of Lebanese Shias who felt marginalized and underrepresented. They weren't just offering protection, they were offering people a sense of identity and empowerment.
Which brings us to this other really fascinating thing about Hezbollah. They're not just a militia anymore. They've evolved into this major political force in Lebanon. They've got seats in parliament. They've got these really impressive social service programs. I mean, the article even mentions that they run schools and hospitals, and they even have their own TV station.
It's a pretty smart strategy. By providing essential services, healthcare, education, and all that, Hezbollah is able to fill the gaps left by the Lebanese state, which is often struggling. This embeds them really deeply in the daily lives of their constituents, especially within the Shia community. For many, they are a lifeline, not just a political party or a militant group.
It really makes you wonder, why does this unusual mix of militancy and social work resonate so much with so many people in Lebanon? Is it just a survival tactic, or is it a genuine expression of their beliefs? Or is it maybe a calculated strategy to gain more support?
That's a question that people are still debating, but it's probably a combination of all those things. Imagine living in a region where conflict and instability are just the norm. Hezbollah offers a feeling of security, a feeling of certainty in a world that's very uncertain. But it's also about identity.
Mm.
Their whole message of resisting external forces, especially Israel, it resonates deeply in a region that is grappling with historical grievances and these ongoing power struggles.
So it's about more than just physical security then. It's about social and cultural identity too. They've tapped into something much deeper than just military strength, it seems.
Exactly. Hezbollah has managed to weave itself into the fabric of Lebanese society. They're not just a political party or a militant group. For a lot of people, they represent resilience. They're a bulwark against a world that often feels stacked against them. And this deep-rooted support is reflected in their military capabilities, which actually leads us to the heart of the Wikipedia article you shared. It claims that Hezbollah is the most capable non-state armed group in the entire region. That's a pretty bold statement. What makes them so formidable?
Right, and the article dives into their training, which could actually be based on Israeli and U.S. military manuals. They focus on things like attrition, mobility, intelligence gathering, and nighttime maneuvers. That's pretty impressive and a little bit unsettling, if you ask me.
It really speaks to their adaptability and strategic thinking. Hezbollah understands that it can't win a conventional war against a power like Israel. So they've honed their skills in asymmetric warfare, maximizing their strengths to exploit the weaknesses of their opponents.
So instead of confronting their adversaries head on, they're focused on making the cost of engagement way too high. It's kind of a David and Goliath strategy, but on a much more sophisticated level.
Exactly. They become masters of using mobility surprise and a deep understanding of the terrain to even the playing field. They've turned a potential weakness, their lack of traditional military hardware, into a strategic asset.
And this is where things get really interesting because while the article stresses their guerrilla tactics, it also highlights the pretty impressive range of weaponry they've got. They've got everything from simple Katyusha rockets to those longer-range Fajar missiles and even the Zelzal.
Which, as the article points out, can actually reach as far as Tel Aviv. This means that no part of Israel is beyond their reach. That's a very powerful deterrent.
No kidding. And speaking of deterrence, the article mentions this almost absurd detail that no one seems to know exactly how many weapons they actually have.
Hmm.
Estimates range from a few thousand to tens of thousands. You'd think that with all the technology we have today, the satellite imagery and the advanced intelligence, we'd have a better idea of how many weapons they actually have.
Well, that's part of what makes Hezbollah such a wild card. They're masters of secrecy and misdirection. They keep their supply lines clandestine, and they benefit from keeping their opponents guessing.
It's like trying to hit a moving target in a smoke-filled room. You know it's there, but good luck pinning it down.
Exactly. But even with all those different estimates, one thing is perfectly clear. Hezbollah has built up an arsenal that's capable of inflicting serious damage. And as we've discussed, they've already shown a chilling willingness to use it.
That brings us to the 2006 Lebanon War. Now, that was a stark reminder of their capabilities. The article says they fired thousands of rockets into Israel during the conflict. Thousands. Imagine living under that kind of constant threat, never knowing when or where the next rocket might strike.
It just goes to show the very real impact of Hezbollah's activities on everyday life, not just in Lebanon, but also in Israel. Those rockets, they weren't aimed at military targets. They were aimed at population centers, which is actually a key element of their strategy. They aim to instill fear and to disrupt daily life, a tactic that has unfortunately been very effective.
That's a chilling thought. And speaking of chilling thoughts, the article mentions a UN resolution that actually demands that Hezbollah disarms. This seems like a major sticking point even within Lebanon itself.
It is. This push for disarmament really gets to the core of the debate surrounding Hezbollah's role in Lebanon.
Okay, so let's break down the arguments at play here. We've got to look at this from all angles.
Of course. On one hand, you have people who view Hezbollah as this essential line of defense for Lebanon, especially against Israel. They point to the territorial disputes that haven't been resolved and the constant threat of another conflict to justify Hezbollah maintaining its armed resistance. They argue that Hezbollah provides a level of security that the Lebanese state just can't match.
Okay, I see. And on the other hand,
You have those who believe that Hezbollah having an independent arsenal undermines Lebanon's sovereignty. They argue that only the Lebanese armed forces should have the power of military force within Lebanon's borders. This side often sees Hezbollah's arsenal as a destabilizing factor, something that could potentially trigger broader conflicts that could devastate Lebanon.
It sounds like a debate with no easy answers, a microcosm of the complexities we see in the region as a whole. And it's really important to remember that we're not here to pick sides in this. The deep dive is about giving you the information you need, not telling you what to think.
Exactly. Our goal is to give you the context and the nuances you need to form your own opinions. We're just here to guide you as you explore this fascinating and, albeit controversial, group.
Well said. Now, before we get into some of the more challenging aspects of Hezbollah's activities, the accusations and controversies, we
Yeah.
really have to address the elephant in the room, or I guess the ammonium nitrate in the port.
You're talking about the horrific Beirut port explosion of 2020. That was a tragedy that shook Lebanon to its core.
Yeah, exactly. The Wikipedia article mentions the explosion, which we know was caused by a massive amount of ammonium nitrate that wasn't stored properly. And of course, all the accusations that came after that connected Hezbollah to those stockpiles.
It's definitely a sensitive topic, and the investigations are still going on. While Hezbollah denies any involvement, the fact that their name even came up says a lot about the weight their activities carry both within Lebanon and on the world stage.
Yeah, it's a harsh reminder that the consequences of these complex geopolitical situations are often felt most acutely by everyday people.
And it underscores how important it is to understand not just what Hezbollah does, but why they do it, what motivates them, what are their ideologies, what historical forces shape this group into what we see today. These are the questions we'll keep exploring as our deep dive continues. It's easy to get so caught up in debating Hezbollah's role, but it's easy to miss just how adaptable their military strategies have been. They've managed to not just survive, but actually thrive in a region as volatile as the Middle East.
Yeah, it's like they wrote the book on asymmetric warfare. I mean, we were just talking about how good they are at blending into Lebanese society, but this article really gets into their actual battlefield tactics, and they're pretty impressive.
Totally. They know they can't go head-to-head with a military force like Israel's in a conventional war, so they've gone in a totally different direction. They focus on mobility, surprise, and really exploiting the weaknesses that are inherent in those traditional military structures.
This Wikipedia article uses a really great line to describe this. It says, Hezbollah is not a small guerrilla group. It is a trained, skilled, well-organized, highly motivated infantry that is equipped with the cream of the crop of modern weaponry. I mean, that paints a pretty vivid picture, right?
It does. It really challenges this image some people might have of like a ragtag militia. There's a group that trains hard, they understand the battle space really well, and they use intelligence gathering as a main part of their strategy.
It even says that their training zeroes in on attrition, mobility, intelligence gathering, and nighttime maneuvers. It's almost as if they've taken all the best parts of these different military doctrines and combined them all into one.
It shows you how adaptable they are. They've studied their adversaries inside and out, learning from both their successes and their failures.
Well, I guess when you're up against some of the most technologically advanced militaries in the world, you either learn to adapt or you don't survive. The article also talks about how much they use tunnels and underground bunkers. Just think about how difficult it must be to create and maintain a network like that completely in secret.
It's a classic guerrilla tactic for sure. But Hezbollah has really taken it to a whole new level. Those tunnels aren't just hideouts for them. They're a strategic asset that lets them move around, undetected launch surprise attacks, and then disappear back into the landscape without a trace.
It's got to be a real dilemma for their adversaries. I mean, think about it. Would you risk sending your troops into what's basically a maze of tunnels where they could easily be walking into an ambush? Or do you rely on airstrikes, which we all know face limitations in urban environments and risk harming civilians?
Right. It creates this kind of strategic paralysis where their opponents have to think long and hard before making any move.
It's like this high-stakes chess match where they're always one step ahead. And that kind of brings us to another really important point. The article mentions the dedication and motivation of these Hezbollah fighters. These aren't just mercenaries. Many of them were brought up in a culture that idolizes this organization. They see it as a protector against all these outside threats.
You're right. It's something that's often overlooked when we talk about warfare. Ideology and belief can be just as powerful as any weapon.
Totally agree. The article even mentions that they often start training these kids at a really young age. Can you imagine the level of commitment that takes? Not just from the individuals, but also from their families.
Yeah, it goes back to what we were saying before about Hezbollah being more than just this military or political organization. They're woven into the very fabric of these communities. They've become an inseparable part of the social structure.
It makes them a much more formidable opponent for sure. Now, we've talked a lot about their tactics and their ideology, but what about the actual weapons and equipment they use? This Wikipedia article goes pretty deep into their arsenal and, well, it's pretty impressive to say the least.
Oh yeah, no doubt. They might not have the tanks, the fighter jets that larger militaries have, but they've put together an arsenal that's surprisingly advanced and really quite diverse. And that's largely thanks to their alliance with Iran.
Yeah, the article specifically mentions anti-tank guided missiles like the Russian-made AT-3 Sagar, AT-4 Spigot, and AT-5 Spandrel. They've even got their hands on some European Milan missiles somehow.
And don't forget about the Iranian-made versions, too. It really shows how resourceful they are. And these weapons aren't just for show, either. Hezbollah used them really effectively against Israeli tanks back in the 2006 war.
It's amazing to think about how they were able to inflict so much damage on a modern armored force using what some people might even call outdated technology.
Right. But it's not about the technology itself. It's about knowing how to use it to your advantage. Hezbollah knows the terrain like the back of their hand. They understand their enemy's weaknesses, and they've truly mastered the art of how to exploit those weaknesses.
So they're basically turning a technological disadvantage into a tactical advantage.
Exactly. That's a perfect example of how asymmetric warfare works. And we can't forget about their anti-aircraft capabilities either. Of course, they don't have the kind of firepower to really go up against the Israeli Air Force, but they can definitely make it super risky and costly for Israeli jets to operate freely in Lebanese airspace.
Right. This article mentions that they've got Zu-23 artillery and then those man-portable SA-7 and SA-18 surface-to-air missiles. Now, that may not give them air superiority, but it definitely raises the stakes if there were ever to be any kind of aerial engagement.
And that's exactly what they want. They want to make any kind of military action against them way too costly.
And as we talked about before, their willingness to engage in urban warfare using all those tunnels and bunkers we were just discussing makes any kind of offensive even more complicated.
Now you're starting to get the bigger picture. Hezbollah's military capabilities aren't about winning some kind of traditional war. It's about deterrence. It's about creating a ton of uncertainty and making the cost of engagement so high that their adversaries just aren't willing to pay it.
Yeah, they're playing a high-stakes game of chess, and from the looks of it, they're playing to win. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and talk about the sea. Believe it or not, Hezbollah has some pretty serious naval capabilities too.
They may not have a full-on navy, but they've definitely realized that the maritime domain is strategically really important. And it makes sense considering that they're located right on the Mediterranean coast.
Yeah, this article talks about how they use these small, fast attack craft that are armed with the C-701 anti-ship missile.
It's all about making the most of their limited resources for maximum impact. They don't need a whole fleet of destroyers. What they need is a way to disrupt shipping lanes, threaten naval vessels, and create a sense of vulnerability.
And those C-701s, while they might not be as technologically advanced as some of the other anti-ship missiles out there, can still inflict a lot of damage.
Oh, absolutely. They could easily take out a warship, disrupt supply lines, and really create chaos and uncertainty in the maritime domain.
It just goes to show that Hezbollah is constantly adapting. They're always evolving their tactics and their weaponry to take advantage of any weakness they can find. They're not just a threat on land. They're a multidimensional threat that requires a really nuanced response. But their capabilities aren't just physical, right?
That's right. And that brings us to one of the most interesting but often overlooked aspects of Hezbollah, their intelligence apparatus.
You've definitely got my attention now. When we talk about Hezbollah's capabilities, we often just default to talking about their military strength. But you're right. Their intelligence operations are a huge part of their overall strategy. I mean, they've somehow stayed one step ahead in a region that's already saturated with intelligence agencies and conflicting agendas. It's almost as if they're playing this high-stakes game of chess, but in the shadows.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. Hezbollah's intelligence apparatus is this, closely guarded secret. And that secrecy is a big part of what makes them so effective. I mean, they've proven time and time again that they're really good at gathering information, infiltrating their enemies, and even influencing events well beyond Lebanon's borders.
This article mentions that they have actual units that are completely dedicated to intelligence gathering, but there aren't a lot of details about them, which makes sense. So what insights can you give us about how these units actually operate and what their scope is?
Well, we don't have a ton of hard data on their intelligence structure, but we can make some educated guesses based on what we do know from open sources and expert analysis. For example, there's one unit that everyone believes is responsible for recruiting and managing assets inside Israel.
Wow, talk about a high-pressure gig. I mean, infiltrating a country that has a security apparatus as tight as Israel's is no easy feat. So what's the main goal there? Is it sabotage? Are they trying to gather intel? Or is it something else entirely?
Their main focus is definitely intelligence gathering. Just imagine having eyes and ears within your enemy's institutions, their military, even their decision-making circles. This human intelligence, humanity is what they call it, gives Hezbollah this really deep understanding of Israeli strategy capabilities and, of course, any vulnerabilities they can exploit.
It's like having access to their playbook. Hezbollah can anticipate their moves and then counter them effectively. It really makes you think. To have that level of infiltration, they must have a really good understanding of Israeli society.
Oh, they absolutely do. To be able to successfully recruit and manage assets in a place like Israel, a place that's as complex and as security conscious as Israel is, you'd have to have this really deep understanding of their culture, their social dynamics, and even people's individual motivations.
It shows you just how patient and strategic they are. They get that in a world that's so focused on technology. Sometimes it's that human element that can make all the difference.
This is also fascinating. Okay, so we've got these different intelligence units. What about the others mentioned in this article? What are they focused on?
Well, another unit seems to be tasked with supporting Palestinian militant groups, those operating in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. This support comes in a lot of different forms, from funding and training to sharing intelligence and even weapons.
So it's not just about going after Israel directly. They're also propping up groups that share their overall objectives, even if their tactics are a bit different. It's like they're trying to create this united front against Israeli influence in the region. Right. Hezbollah sees itself as part of this larger resistance movement, this whole network of groups and even state actors who all share common interests and who are united in their opposition to what they see as Western imperialism and Israeli aggression. And this network, this axis of resistance, goes way beyond the Middle East.
Which leads us to this third intelligence unit that's mentioned in the article. And honestly, it's really vague. It's almost like they're operating in complete secrecy. What can you tell us about this mysterious entity?
Honestly, the fact that we know next to nothing about it speaks volumes. Intelligence agencies, by their very nature, they have to operate in the shadows. But the fact that we know so little about this particular unit tells me that they're involved in really sensitive operations, stuff that goes way beyond Lebanon and Israel. This could be anything from tracking their enemies, monitoring threats, or even engaging in counterintelligence to protect Hezbollah's interests on a global scale.
It's like when you see those big black redacted bars on declassified documents. You know there's something juicy hidden there, but we might never know the full story. It definitely adds to the mystique surrounding Hezbollah. But speaking of things we may never know the full story on, we can't really ignore the elephant in the room or the looming question, I guess, of terrorism.
Yeah, it's definitely a complicated issue and one that's really emotionally charged, especially when you're talking about Hezbollah.
You got that right. The article does mention their official stance on the 9/11 attacks, and, well, let's just say it's nuanced.
It really is. It says that Hezbollah condemned al-Qaeda's attacks on the World Trade Center. They called them attacks on innocent people, but they never really said anything about the Pentagon attack. They didn't condemn it, and they didn't condone it.
It's a fine line to walk. They're willing to condemn an attack on civilians, but they hesitate when it comes to a military target, even one as symbolic and as important as the Pentagon. It really highlights how hard it is to pin down a universal definition of terrorism.
Totally.
Yeah.
It's that old saying, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. Hezbollah has always been really careful to frame their actions within the context of resistance against what they see as foreign occupation.
Yeah.
That narrative is absolutely key to their whole ideology, and it's a huge part of their appeal both within Lebanon and among their supporters around the world.
It's a good reminder that if you really want to understand Hezbollah, or any group for that matter, you have to look beyond those simple labels we like to use. You have to look at the history, the grievances, and the narratives that have shaped how they see the world.
Absolutely. You have to understand the complexities, the gray areas, and all those seemingly contradictory motivations that drive human behavior, especially when it comes to something like geopolitics.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Well, we've covered a ton of ground in this deep dive into Hezbollah. We've explored their history, their ideology, those intricate military strategies, and, of course, their super secretive intelligence operations. So as we wrap things up, what's the one big takeaway you hope our listeners will walk away with today?
I think Hezbollah's story really highlights the importance of strategic thinking adaptability and having a deep understanding of not just the physical battlefield, but the human one as well. They've defied all the labels people have tried to put on them, and they've evolved from the small militia into a powerful political and military force that continues to shape the Middle East as we know it.
They're definitely a force to be reckoned with, that's for sure. And as we've seen, their story is far from over. With everything that's going on in the region, the instability, their growing capabilities, and this complex web of alliances, well, I have a feeling we haven't heard the last of Hezbollah.
I think you're right. If you want any hope of understanding where the Middle East is headed, we have to understand Hezbollah's past and present actions. Hopefully this deep dive has given our listeners a better, more nuanced perspective on this complex and incredibly influential organization.
Well said. This has been a really incredible journey into the heart of Hezbollah. We hope you found it as insightful as we have. This is the deep dive signing off for now. But as always, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deeper into the stories that shape our world.